good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the second virtual dialogue that the UN Women Training Center has hosted in this 216 year. Today, we will be discussing theory of change and feminist pedagogies for training for gender equality. I am Clemencia Munoz. I'm the Chief of UN Women's Training Center. And civil society to international organizations, UN agencies, and academia. We are also honored to be joined by 4 panelists who are experts in theory of change and feminist pedagogies. These are Ms. Myra Marx Ferree, Professor of Sociology, University of Wisconsin, United States; Lucy Ferguson, Consultant for the UN Women Training Center and Research Fellow at the Universidad Complutense of Madrid, Spain; Anand Pawar, Executive Director of SAMYAK, a Communications and Resource Center in India; and Lian Cheng Li, International Reference Panel for the Freire Institute, Malaysia. Today's webinar will be moderated by Emma Redlatt and Ruya Legari, consultants for our virtual dialogues. Before handing over to Emma, allow me to explain a little bit more about UN Women's Training Center Community of Practice. This is an open platform of 1,700 experts, academics, and practitioners in training for gender equality. Virtual dialogues hosted by the Community of Practice are a mechanism for us as training practitioners to continually discuss and share knowledge and lessons learned, as well as to nurture a community for collective learning across the world. This would be our 8th virtual dialogue by our Community of Practice. Despite its growing popularity, training for gender equality currently lacks clarity on 2 core issues. 1, a theory of how change occurs through training, and 2nd, how feminist pedagogical principles can be applied to training to evoke such change. This is an opportunity to reflect on these 2 issues in a participatory manner and debate their significance for training for gender equality. The overall objective of today's virtual dialogue is therefore to discuss the development and added value of theories of change for training for gender equality and how feminist pedagogical principles can be applied to training to evoke lasting change. Today's webinar offers a space for reflection that will support UN Women and our stakeholders to move towards ever more transformative training for gender equality worldwide. I will now hand over to Emma to begin moderating the session.
Thank you, Clemencia. This webinar is part of a 3-week-long virtual dialogue that has been taking place on the Community of Practice discussion forum. We remind you that this online discussion will continue during this week and the coming week. We hope you have been and will be able to participate and contribute with your experiences and knowledge in the virtual dialogue forum discussion. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour and feature 4 presentations by our panel members. This will be followed by a round of questions from our audience members. To participate, please use the toolbar to the right of the webinar platform marked Questions at any time. The coordination team will be keeping an eye on your contributions, and my co-moderator will pose questions on your behalf to our speakers after the presentations. We will be using a question and answer format to simplify our discussion today. Any questions that we cannot get to due to time constraints will be posted on the Community of Practice discussion forum after the webinar has ended. I would also like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded. The recorded version will be posted on the Community of Practice webpage later today. The virtual dialogue discussion is guided by key questions. Each week, key questions are posted on the Community of Practice platform. Today's webinar will highlight some of these questions, including: what should a theory of change for training for gender equality entail? How can theories of change and feminist pedagogies inform one another? How can feminist pedagogical principles be applied in training for gender equality? We will now turn to the presentations by our panel members. First, we are very fortunate to have with us today Myra Marx Ferree. Myra is a professor of sociology and a member of the Gender and Women's Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the USA. She has written numerous books and articles about feminist organizations and politics internationally, as well as about the inclusion of gender in theory and practice. She has received the Jessie Bernard Award, sociology's highest honor for work in gender, and she has been the president of the international organization Sociologists for Women in Society. Myra, I'm going to unmute you now, and I'd ask you to please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You can put the first slide up. What I wanted to talk about today is the question of what training does in relationship to any kind of theory of change. And the idea is that training is the place where knowledge about gender relations and the actual politics of feminist practice connect on the ground, or as we sociologists are fond of saying, it's vernacularization. That is to say, it's like speaking in the local language. And it is the UN Gender Training Center that's in this vital location between the local, where work can and should be conducted in diverse vernaculars, local speech, and the global, where the overall normative institutionalization of gender equality draws its authority, for example, from the UN documents. Could we go to the next slide? It's important at the global level. Could we go to the next slide, please? It's important at the global level to think about norms. Norms are necessarily abstract. No, back, please. Norms are necessarily abstract, but the important thing about norms is that they're created in an active dialogue across multiple places. And they can't spread, even though sociologists sometimes talk about diffusion, just spreading. In fact, norms or shared meanings never diffuse passively, never diffuse just because people announce them or sign a document, whether it's a human rights concordate or pass a law. Norms are simply a meaning that's there that actually needs to be transmitted by people meeting minds, and then also turning that into local meanings. The key issue in terms of the spread of norms is that they need to be shaped not in the abstract at which the global level operates, but in the local level. And that means that norms require what is called participatory action research, a collective process of assessing needs, critiquing what we already know, and learning at the local level. We want to change these kinds of norms at a global level, but we want to do it in a way that makes sense at the local level. But norms are not the only thing we want to change. We also want to change structures, the actual practices, the physical relationships that make systems work. How does an organization function? The kind of thing we represent in an organizational chart. The kind of thing that happens in the actual work that's done when you show up in a workplace. workplaces are in fact real spaces. Nothing happens in a social vacuum. People interact with each other. Structures are generated and changed through the actual practices of actual people. Actions that people take have reactions. And one of the most important things to realize about the changes in norms and changes in structures that gender mainstreaming is about and that training is about is that it is a political process. The actions that are taken have reactions, and it's not somehow something that should surprise anyone that resistance is encountered, that people say, oh, but we've always done it this way, or no, that's an attack on something that I value. No, structures that need to change through a political process of sharing meanings and seeing a widespread acceptance of different ways of doing things, making new things normal. We go to the next slide, please. When we think about this back and forth between the global level of norms and the local level of meanings that people actually hold, the research that we do, the practices that we experience, we can think about training for gender equality as having two kinds of effects. And we make a big mistake if we confuse the two, because our long-term model of change is one in which the norms and structures are transformed in a deep way, and these are systematically interrelated. Therefore, you can't expect to identify this is a cause and this is an effect. Cause and effect go back and forth. It's more like a circle than it is like an arrow. And the other thing that's important about aiming for transformation is the more successful you are at transforming norms and structures, the more likely it is that the change itself becomes absorbed and invisible and part of just the way we do things here. So, for example, nobody stops and says, gee, is it right that women as well as men have the right to vote? No. Voting is one of those things that was transformed, not without struggle and not without a period of time and not without the back and forth between the global goal and the local work to make that happen. But now it's invisible. Nobody really thinks of women voters as the product of a serious change towards gender equality at the normative and the structural level. So that's what we're really aiming for, is that kind of long-term, invisible, circular transformation. But what do we actually expect to see? Mostly we work at the short term. And at the short term, we can think about a number of different purposes that gender equality training can make for change. One is the empowerment of individual actors and the ways in which the individual is able to do things, in part because they believe that they can. The other is a kind of capacity building for organizations to do this. Another is the kind of development of skills by which the feelings of empowerment get translated into the capacities of organizations or groups or individuals. The thing is about short-term models is that it's really only in the short term that we can see a causal order between what we do and what we get out of it. Most of the time, we're aiming for some kind of specific short-term change. And therefore, we should always be very clear about what is it that we are trying to change and what should be visible through this kind of change. So if what we're trying to change are norms, then we should be able to explain which norms we're trying to change and in what way we're trying to change them and how we expect that change in norms to feed back into a longer-term process of change. But we shouldn't expect a change of norms to mean that it automatically produces a change in structures or practices. If we want to change practices, then we need to focus on changing practices. And have an idea about how changing that particular practice will, in the long term, feed back around into changing norms or changing capacities. But in the short term, if what we want to change is practice, we shouldn't be measuring or expecting change in norms. We should be expecting just the change in practices that we are actually looking at in the short term for changing. And those kinds of changes, whether they're changes in norms or changes in practices or changes in institutional structures, should be visible to others. And we should also expect in the short term that anything that is changed will also cause reactions, some of which are helping to spread transformation and some of which are forms of resistance. So the theory of change that I'm suggesting here is one in which both short-term and long-term change are what we want to be accomplishing, but that at any given moment we should be very clear about what our specific short-term goals are, because those are the only ones we're going to be able to see and measure, and think in the longer term about how we can make our short-term changes more integrated in what's going on already so that they become invisible, normal, just the way we do things here, where nobody would say, well, we do this because this is good for gender equality. We do this because this is who we are, this is what we do, this is the way we think about the world, this is the way the structures here work best, this is just the way things are. And that's what we're really aiming for, is to make ourselves invisible and unnecessary, but we're never going to achieve that in terms of any one short-term change. And thinking in the short term about whether it's empowerment or skill development or capacity building, whether it's normative change or change in practice that we're aiming for, or an institutional structural change that we're aiming for, that's the only way we can actually see and measure and know that we're having an effect. And that's on to the next.
Thank you very much, Myra, for your insightful presentation on theory of change. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from our audience members, and I remind you that you can pose questions using the question bar on the right-hand side of the platform. We will now hear from Lucy Ferguson. Lucy is an international consultant and expert in training for gender equality. She has worked widely on this subject for the UN Women Training Center, UN Women, and UNWTO. In addition to serving as a consultant for the UN Women Training Center, she is a leading academic in the field of training, having co-edited the book, The Politics of Feminist Knowledge Transfer, Gender Training and Gender Expertise, published this year by Palgrave. She has also designed an innovative online training course on gender mainstreaming for the Commonwealth Secretariat. Lucy has published extensively as a gender and development expert in prominent academic international journals. She is also a research fellow at the University of Complutense in Madrid, Spain. Lucy, I'd ask you to please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you to everybody listening and to my co-panelists. These are very interesting questions and diverse presentations. Also, there have been some excellent points so far on the online forum for the virtual dialogue, so I hope I can contribute some things to this ongoing discussion. These questions are at the very forefront of my mind at the moment. Sorry, can you go back, please? I'm still on the introduction. Thanks. These questions are at the very forefront of my mind at the moment because I've been supporting the UN Women Training Center to develop some working papers on these topics, namely a theory of change from training for gender equality and feminist pedagogies in training for gender equality. So in order to structure my presentation and speak to the specific question that I was asked to look at, I first will talk about the training cycle as a lens for understanding training for gender equality. Then I'll talk a little about pedagogies in the training cycle, then theory of change in the training cycle, and then a short discussion on how these can inform each other. Next slide, please. The training cycle we are all familiar with. It's a way of framing the processes of training for gender equality and also presenting the way in which training is a cyclical, ongoing process with different aspects feeding in at different points, reflecting back on what Myra said about different feedback coming in from different areas. A key organizing principle of the papers on which I've been working is that any work on feminist pedagogies and theory of change for training for gender equality need to be context specific. And this again goes back to Myra's work here, because training for gender equality happens in a wide range of scopes and a wide range of remits, and it's not possible to apply one specific theory of change or one idea of feminist pedagogies in a blanket way across all aspects and locations and contexts. The idea of presenting here through the training cycle is that this allows for a visual and a conceptual representation of training for gender equality as an ongoing cyclical process which needs to be looked at as not in a linear, straightforward way, but rather as something more complicated, more messy, and with lots of different stages, each of which feed forwards and backwards as shown in the diagram here. And I think that these kinds of insights are useful for helping us to demonstrate the impact of training for gender equality, which is at the moment a very difficult thing to do, and something as a field that I think that we need to work on more. We are working on more, and to argue the case for setting out in more concrete ways how exactly we understand training to contribute to change, both in the short term, as Myra discussed, and also in the longer term, as Myra discussed. Next slide, please. So thinking again about the training cycle, I'm looking at how feminist pedagogies can be applied at different phases. We have worked together on some core principles for feminist pedagogies in training for gender equality, which are in the concept note, and they're also on the virtual dialogue, and we'd be interested in your feedback and input into those principles. This is a way to map those principles and suggest some practical ways in which those principles can be enacted at different stages in the cycle. So in terms of analysis and planning, in the papers it's argued that a flexible approach is needed when setting the parameters of the training, and yet nevertheless it's important to maintain a commitment to a feminist project of transformative social change during that initial analysis and planning process for any training initiative or project. Then in terms of moving on to design and development, it's important to strike a balance between acknowledging the many challenges that exist that we all know from our daily work in terms of promoting critical thinking within organizations, institutions, groups, the different contexts in which training has taken place, and yet while acknowledging those challenges, to work together to strive for how we can use transformative learning strategies in order to continue to promote critical thinking. And this is all of these challenges and tensions need to go into the design and development process of any training curriculum and initiative. In terms of implementation, I think this is where we probably are most comfortable with discussing feminist pedagogies, and we are, as trainers, we want to maximize the potential of the training scenario to integrate feminist pedagogical principles and practices even when we can see very clearly what the limitations, challenges, resistances, and institutional politics and power dynamics are with which we are dealing. So it's about finding practical ways to continue to work in a feminist pedagogical way within a range of constraints. And then finally, we are also as a field working on evaluation for training for gender equality, again in order to demonstrate the impact and change, to show how we are working towards our short-term and long-term goals. And for feminist pedagogical principles, these need to be built explicitly into the design and implementation of evaluation strategies to make sure that we're able to reflect on and test whether our pedagogical practices are having the results and the evoking the kinds of reactions and responses that we are hoping to work towards. Next slide, please. Now, changing subject to theory of change, I just want to clarify here, as has been clarified on the online forum and in the concept note, we're looking at theory of change in two different ways. In a sense, we need to think in a very conceptual, analytical way about theories of change for training for gender equality. We also can use the theory of change methodology in order to bring some of those questions into a more concrete way and develop specific theories of change in different contexts. So in the papers we develop an argument for systematically incorporating a theory of change approach, and in that sense I mean the theory of change methodology, into the course development process. And here are just some very brief ideas about how this can be done. So first of all, at the analysis and planning stage, it's important that training is explicitly embedded in a broader change project within an organization or institution, and that is very clear what that change project is. And a theory of change methodology here can be used to demonstrate the ways and the assumptions on which training is expected to contribute to that broader change project, both in the short term and in the longer term. Next, at the design and development phase, again, whilst designing the curriculum, whilst looking at the content, the approach, the methods, the different aspects of training, design and development should be considered and developed in terms of how they contribute to the theory of change. And again, this is another opportunity to question our assumptions about change, to question our interventions, and to continue to reflect on how exactly we expect this work to contribute to the kinds of change that we are hoping to achieve. And then finally, the evaluation stage of the training cycle is another opportunity to revisit the theory of change methodology, to reflect on the assumptions and challenges that were identified, explore and reflect on the training initiative, and revise accordingly the theory of change and take out from that and extrapolate broader lessons learned that can be taken on for future work. Next slide, please. So I was asked to think about how theories of change and feminist pedagogies can inform each other. And I think it's challenging to tie together the different aspects of training for gender equality that we're looking at. But nevertheless, it is important for us to develop a coherent approach to how these different aspects can work together. As such, I would argue that both a theory of change approach and a focus on feminist pedagogical principles and practices both of these can be seen as key building blocks or fundamental aspects of working towards high quality training for gender equality, which works in a substantive way towards both short-term and long-term change and transformation. And I think there are three key values or approaches that we can bear in mind when we work towards this. First, an acknowledgement of the cyclical and sometimes unpredictable and non-linear nature of training for gender equality as reflected in the training cycle, whereby there are different points of exchange and interweaving of the different processes, and these bring up opportunities for exchange and informing each other. Secondly, a reflexive approach which we adopt throughout each aspect of the training cycle and the broader processes involved in training for gender equality. So it's a continual, ongoing process of critical reflection. And finally, the importance of, I've called it peer review, but I think we've called it many different things already, which is understanding that this is a collective effort by the field. We need to work together in activities such as this, using platforms such as the Community of Practice of the UN Women Training Centre, and find ways to collectively reflect on these questions, share experiences and practices, and work together to maximize the impact of training for gender equality towards transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your insight into theory of change and the connection with feminist pedagogies. We remind our audience to keep posting questions using the question tab on the right hand of the platform. We will now turn to our next two guest speakers and to Feminist Pedagogies. We are very lucky to have with us today Lian Cheng. Lian forms part of the International Reference Panel for the Freire Institute. As a feminist popular educator, facilitator, trainer, and activist scholar, she has fostered the empowerment of marginalized groups, especially working class women, and has designed and facilitated training programs to strengthen capacities of individuals, grassroots communities, and civil society organizations. She has nurtured the development of networks among women workers, adult educators, engaged scholars, and has served on the boards of numerous regional organizations. Lian recently retired as an academic, but continued to be passionately engaged in capacity development initiatives for social transformation, gender equity, and girls and women's empowerment. Lian, I'd ask you to please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, can I speak now?
Yes, please. Thank you, Lian.
Greetings, co-panelists and the members of COP out there. Good evening. Just a small amendment. I'm from Malaysia, but the Freire Institute is located in UK. Now, I will have some preamble statements before I highlight what feminist pedagogy is, and I was asked to also highlight what are some of the challenges encountered in the practice of feminist pedagogy and how there have been attempts to address them. To start off with, I'd like to highlight that we all live in an unequal capitalist society, and also within a patriarchal system that is structured, male-dominated, male-centered, and male-identified, or to be more precise, very structured in a masculinity manner, be it at home, workplace, or society at large, and through the various institutions that impact on our lives by unequal relationships of power between those in positions of economic privilege and political power and the oppressed. Now, all these institutions incur various forms of systems of oppression on our individual and collective realities. When we talk about feminist pedagogy, it's actually used to address issues of oppression, exploitation, and bring us to work to examine the situations. And feminist pedagogy actually focuses on pedagogical approaches that help people who have experienced exploitation, oppression, especially when people often legitimate this oppression. Before I discuss what feminist pedagogy is, I like to just highlight the previous slide. Not yet. I like to highlight the roots of feminist pedagogy. Feminist pedagogy actually is quite very much rooted and influenced by some of the progressive social movements and educational movements that emphasize participatory, engaging, interactive, experiential learning, and a reclamation of the civic mission of emancipatory education in democracy. But more importantly, a critical common link is to critical pedagogies, or what Freire has termed as liberatory pedagogy. Feminist pedagogy has much in common with various ideas about education and classroom practices, while also critiquing his failure to address the issue of gender. Like Freire's liberatory pedagogy, feminist pedagogy is based on assumptions about power and consciousness raising. It acknowledges the existence of oppression as well as the possibility of ending it, and foregrounds the desire for the primary goal of personal and social transformation. And this is what feminist pedagogy aims. There have been a lot of confusion over what feminist pedagogy is. A lot of people have referred it to as a toolbox, a collection of methods, of strategies, a list of practices, or a specific classroom arrangement. It is not that. Now, I'd like to highlight what feminist pedagogy is. The key concerns in feminist pedagogy revolve around the key questions of what do we teach or train and why? How do we train and why? How does what and how we teach impact upon the people that we work with, including the communities that these people that we work with reach out? As a pedagogical approach, feminist pedagogy is appropriate for all groupings, for all gender groupings, if contextualized. It can be used in any disciplinary context or any form of social change work, from capacity building workshops to formal classrooms to adult education settings or community settings, or in this particular case, in gender equality training. I like now to highlight what constitutes feminist pedagogy. It is grounded on a pedagogical framework that is circumscribed by feminist theory. First, it is rooted in feminist epistemology, where the understanding that knowledge is neither neutral or sterile, but is socially constructed. And gender influence our concept of knowledge and how that knowledge has been produced. So in the area of feminist epistemology, the whole understanding of situated knowledge, procedural knowledge, subjugated knowledge is all very real in the context of feminist pedagogy. Indeed, there are different types of knowledge, and we need to get to these different types of knowledge. But very important behind this epistemology is that knowledge is socially constructed, and it is not produced by experts out there. A second element is the important role of experience and emotions. Personal lived experience is recognized as a valid and valued form of knowing. Emotions are also acknowledged as part of what it means to know and how we know what we know. Indeed, to have beliefs, values, and convictions is to have emotions, and these emotions must be recognized in order to facilitate greater and more critical understanding. For instance, when we strive for equity and justice, it often leads to frustration, anger, stress, relief, joy, and pride. Identifying the relationship between experience, emotion, and action will help learners bridge the training space and the real world, the personal and the political, the theory and practice. While perspectives, emotions, and resulting opinions are relevant to learning, these are understood as contextualized, limited, and bound to structures of power. Therefore, sorry, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes, yes.
There's a break here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because there's a break here that indicates.
Oh, it's okay. You can go ahead and continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the real challenge is how do we communicate and take on board emotions as part of the important part of knowledge making. Next, the co-construction of knowledge production. It is grounded on the belief that learners, participants, are equally playing an important role in the co-production of knowledge. Conventional challenges. Feminist pedagogy challenges the conventional pedagogies. It challenged the traditional views and practices, the notion that knowledge and teaching can be free, can be value-free. The conventional epistemological approaches that singularly focus on rationality and expert knowledge has been challenged. In fact, what is needed is the creation of space for subjugated persons to speak, for listening to what they silence, for listening to their silences. And this needs the inclusion of body and emotions, and not just knowledge as rationality, knowledge as from the expert. The focus is on the knower, that which is known, and the process of coming to know that knowledge. Thus, what is advocated in feminist pedagogy is that it incorporates a scrutiny of content, of learning processes and relationships within the learning environment. At its heart is a political challenge to notions and structures of knowledge and power. Goals. What are the goals? It has been already highlighted in the first presentation. The ultimate goal is definitely for social change and social transformation. But that's the end goal. But along the way, it's very important to help to create critical consciousness, various forms of social action, empowerment, helping subjugated people to reclaim their authentic identities, which is framed as what empowerment is all about, even though that has been depoliticized over the past decades. The values and commitments underlying feminist pedagogy highlights a critical view of power and authority. At the heart of feminist pedagogy is a concern about notions of power, authority, and control. Like it or not, the role of trainer comes with plenty of authoritarian trappings. And the role of trainees is wrapped in assumptions about differential status and behavior. Therefore, feminist pedagogy compels the consideration of the complex dynamics of power within the training space, especially the inherent power differences between participants and learners, questions of who has power, how is power deployed and to what end, how does power influence the teaching and learning processes, are all fundamentally important. Feminist pedagogy also recognizes the complexity of identities, especially differences and similarities and the intersectionality of identities. It is committed to a nuanced understanding of identity that acknowledges the differences and similarities between and among learners and trainers. This critical recognition of differences between and among people, especially their lived experiences, in fact sensitizes to diversity and to be attentive to the specific identities, histories, and needs of trainees within a specific context, rather than assuming everyone is the same. The multiplicity and unreviewed identities also introduce the notion of intersectionality. That is to say that any individual is embodied in various social positions which are overlapping and variably depending upon context. So the multiple identities that an instructor, her students, her trainees, and the course brings to the classroom are always present and active. I like now to also just to summarize it by highlighting the importance of community and collectivity in the methodologies and methods. The learning environment is, of course, very important. In terms of challenges, there are many challenges. I would just like to highlight a couple of them here. The whole issue of safety. There are various attempts in feminist pedagogy to address safety. However, no matter how much you try to ensure a safe and trusting environment by adopting all sorts of techniques, even introducing various forms of breathing exercises and so forth to create calmness among us, issues of safety always arises. And in fact, what we actually need to do is that rather than seeking just to construct a safe, totally non-conflict area, we should be focused on generating a dialogue that can be open to tension and disagreement, so that a contested space that supports rather than ignore conflict exists. And around this whole area is also the challenge of silences. There are two areas of silences. Silences in terms of resistance and silences in terms of the kind of disabling experiences that oppressed people experience, and how do we evoke this silence. It's a great challenge because unless these silences have been evoked, we are not able to bring people together to unpack and to articulate the issues that they have. And underlying this is a whole lot of resistance. Resistance happens in various forms. Very often, participatory methods also bring resistance to surface and promote conflict and change. And this is a great challenge. So how do we as trainers actually equip ourselves to feel comfortable with challenge and to take that on board to address them as part of the whole training process? And tied up with this is our understandings of capacities of trainers in the whole training program. How do we equip ourselves? How do we create an openness and to work with discomfort? And lastly, another big challenge is the whole area on issues of power and empowerment. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but maybe questions can be addressed later on. Sorry, I've taken a bit of time. Thank you.
And no worries, Lian. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation on feminist pedagogies. I'm sure there will be questions further ahead. Finally, we are fortunate to have with us today Anand Pawar. Anand is the Executive Director of SAMYAK, a communication and resource center based in Pune, India. He has extensive experience as a gender trainer in India and internationally. As an international consultant and researcher, he is involved in the conceptualizing and contextualizing of training for gender equality. Anand is an active member of the South Asian Network to Address Masculinities, SANAM, and is one of the International Advisory Council members of the Women's Peacemaker Program in The Hague, Netherlands. Anand, I'd ask you to please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for this introduction, and thank you, Myra, Lucy, and Lee for your presentations. And I also want to thank you because you made my work easy, as a wider ground of the discussion is already covered. We have more than 275 participants across the world, and thank you all for listening to this presentation. So can we go to the first slide, which titles as what is being taught and how it is being taught. So as we all are aware, the fundamental premise of this discussion is that the training on gender equality lacks conceptual clarity on one, theory of how change occurs, and two, feminist pedagogical principles. So the assumption here is that inclusion of feminist pedagogical principles can evoke the, I'm using it in quotes, desired change through gender training, which already have become popular across the world and across developmental practice. As we already, our earlier speakers already have deliberated on that. Now it is very interesting to deliberate more on the term desired change. In fact, we need to reflect on the word change in itself. Are we talking about desired change, or do we really mean transformation in its broader theoretical sense? And we heard Myra talking about long-term goal as a transformation which we expect out of these gender training programs. It is quite observed in the practice of gender training that teaching gender certainly have shown change in attitudes of participants of the training programs, but closer and deeper analysis further shows that it has failed in transforming gender power relations. The word change has a connotation of temporariness to it, while the word transformation is about changing the character of something or someone, especially so that the thing or the person is improved. Gender training from feminist perspective certainly aim for profound and radical change in gender power relations, and hence we need to replace the word change by the word transformation in every context of gender training, be it assessment, planning the content, pedagogy, or measuring the impact of the training. This could be an effective strategy in shifting our focus from what is being taught to how it is being taught. My second point here on this slide is about teaching gender. I believe that feminist pedagogy is not about teaching something to someone, but it is more of creating such learning environment where collective learning can happen and all those participating in the process has agency in creating and sharing knowledge, as our earlier speakers already have mentioned. We need to critically reflect on the term teaching gender, as conventionally teaching means ideas or principles taught by an authority. Of course, many scholars have tried defining teaching in different terms, but conventionally in many societies and many cultures, especially in South Asia and maybe other parts of the southern parts of the world, teaching has innate meaning of authoritarian transfer of knowledge from teacher to the student. The ideas are delivered to a student or pupil who do not have it. The conventional idea of teaching thus creates power relation between a trainer and participants. Lean also was mentioning about that. And it manifests differently in different societies and different cultures, in different political contexts too. Even if one uses participatory teaching learning process, it is still largely remains teacher-centric in nature, and it comes to planning pedagogy for such training activities. When it comes to planning participatory trainings, teaching. Feminist pedagogy, in contrary, is about creating and sharing knowledge for the purpose of collective learning. The idea here is to make the process learner-centric, where a learner has agency in validation of personal and life experiences. It becomes more important in the context of gender training. It can only be achieved by creating an environment where it becomes a self-facilitated process of learning new ideas and or thoughts, or learning for accepting new gender norms through self-facilitated growth process in the form of self-reflection, realization, and actualization by an individual or a group to tap hidden potentials and further develop it to accept and adopt new life-enhancing positive social norms and practices. And so critical thinking and reflexivity has to be at the core of how, of facilitating gender learning of participants. But the next question is, what is it for? Why we want to create such discourse of learner-centric pedagogy for gender training? I believe this is very crucial. How of learning gender and allied concept has to be towards challenging unequal gender power relations and transforming them into more equal and just society. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now it is, and now as Lean was saying, in the age of depoliticization of almost every spheres of life, we still run the risk of losing the meaning of term feminist pedagogy unless we strongly advocate the meaning and spirit of it. The quantum of gender trainings across the world is huge, and the political meaning of the term feminist pedagogy may get lost if it simply gets replaced with participatory training techniques. We need to keep reinforcing that feminist pedagogy in gender training is not just about techniques to be used in teaching learning process, but it is about collective learning for a broader objective of transforming gender power relations in personal and institutional settings. It is not just about acquiring knowledge and skills about gender, but it is about moving towards action and plan activism to challenge and change gender power relations which are systemic in nature. It is not just about training to design measurable indicators. It is about doing gender the way feminists would do on the principles of diversity, inclusion, making emotional connections, and celebrating all of these three: diversity, inclusion, and connections. Based on synthesis and reflections on feminist pedagogy for gender training, we at SAMYAK follow KARA model for gender training, especially of men. Kara is a Marathi word which actually means in English act. Especially with men, my major experience come from doing gender trainings with men in different settings like communities, schools and colleges, institutions and CSOs. Here I am trying to explain the model in brief. K is about gender unequal power relations and intersections. It is about knowing gender unequal power relations in personal and public spheres of life and understanding its intersectional context in your own reality of caste, class, race, gender and sexual identities, regional identities, etc. And know that gender unequal relations has interface with all these diverse inequalities in different societies and different cultures. Know that gender power relations are linked with other structures of power, and it operates in micro and macro realities. A stands for accepting it in your personal and public spheres. It is very important to bring people to the table to just accept that such an unequal power relations do exist in our societies in various different forms, and we have internalized them through various ways. It does exist in your personal and public spheres of life. There is need for deschooling or de-learning of notions of equality that many people has in their mind. These notions of equality could be symbolic or numeric in nature, or it could be linked with programs for gender equality, thinking that gender equality programs are bringing transformation. Through our feminist gender trainings, we do deliberate on why gender equality is not just about changing roles and men rolling chapatis or men taking care of their babies. It is about accepting the fact that gender unequal power is systemic in nature, and working towards gender equality is about changing these gender power relations in personal and public spheres of life. I go to R of Kara. R is reflect on your personal privileges and restrictions. It is important to design facilitation of gender trainings where participants get opportunity to reflect on their personal privileges and restrictions in the context of their own gender realities and in the context of given socio-cultural and their political realities, because we all are not equal. And A is about act towards bringing transformation, act towards bringing transformative change in gender power relations in personal and institutional setting to create a new situation of gender just societies. So, can we go to the next slide, please? So I think it is about politicization of gender trainings, and we need paradigm shift for this transformation, this paradigm shift in the way gender trainings are focused around the discourse of men and women. And I think that discourse need to really go beyond the social construct of individual men and women, but we need to really bring in the whole discourse around how hegemonic masculinities and subordinate femininities are constructed in given societies and given cultures and given political settings in the given point of time. And we strongly believe that, unless we start, and as I said, my experiences come largely from facilitating trainings with men and boys. I think, unless we really bring the personal the personal is political, the politics of the personal is political to the gender trainings, it is not really going to move towards transformative changes. So no gender trainings without knowing feminisms, all different forms and types of feminisms in different parts of the world, and without, it should be linked with the analysis of patriarchies in different societies and intersectionality. And it should also create opportunity for the learners, for the participants to validate their personal experiences in their own context. I always find that there is always risk of, we run the risk of, participants learning just the language of equality. Because in my practice, I always saw that many men do learn the language of equality, but when it comes to transforming their gender power relations, it is difficult to even see that, or people share their experiences, what kind of difficulties they go through. So there is always this potential risk that our learners are learning the language of equality, and one cannot really find tick mark, yes or no kind of attitude change in our learnings. So we need to say no to the symbolic changes, and we need to say yes to transformation. For instance, as I said, gender equality, one need to really see that transforming relation is not going to be men getting into kitchen or men just getting into taking care of their babies. That can be short-term kind of idea, as Myra was saying, but the vision should be of changing and transforming gender power relations. In our gender training programs, one also needs to recognize the diversity of context. There cannot be global solutions to resolve the problems in social and cultural realities of my village named Kurdwadi in the district of Solapur in the state of Maharashtra in India. So that the contextualization and localization of problem and need to be really focused on. And for that, to measure that change, we also need to have transformative indicators, localized and contextualized. And I end with this quote which I used in one of my conference in India, that says, when the jungle is at fire, you cannot just save your own tree. We cannot just talk about gender-based violence. We need to talk about violence in totality. We need to really address cultures of violence in the entire world. So we need to really politicize our gender training programs and gender training activities. Thank you. I'm done with my presentation.
Thank you very much, Anand, for sharing with us your excellent experience on feminist pedagogies. To enhance our discussion today, we will now turn to questions from our audience members, and I will give the word to my co-moderator, Ruya Ligari, to run this section. We're going to change the slides between each other.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm just going to put on my screen. I hope you can all see this. Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to our panelists for their excellent presentations. I think we've had a very insightful webinar today, and throughout we've been receiving questions from our audience. Because we don't have that much time, I'd like to pose just a selection of these questions now to our panel members. And I'd like to remind you all that any questions that we can't get to today due to time constraints will be posted on the virtual dialogue discussion forum in the Community of Practice platform. First, we have some questions on theory of change. So perhaps I would just like to pose these to Myra and to Lucy. First, perhaps Myra, Maggie would like to know that she says that I understand that it may be impossible to measure normative change in the short term. Is it not possible to measure this over an extended period of time? If so, could you speak a little bit about why you believe normative change can't be measured?
Okay. I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. I didn't express myself as clearly as I should have, I'm sure. I believe we can measure normative change in the short term or in the long term, and I think we can measure changes in practices over the short term or over the long term, and I think we can measure changes in structures over the short term or the long term. What I'm trying to say, however awkwardly, is that we need to be careful about what it is we think we're teaching and what it is we think we're measuring. And so I think, for example, it comes back to the point about say, learning how to endorse a norm and say things about gender equality and give lip service to gender equality, that kind of learning a norm doesn't necessarily have any effect on practices or structures, or similar, at least not in the short term. In the long term it may. We're seeing ways in which normative change over the long term is being fed into changes in practices and structures as well as norms at a local or vernacularized level. But if what we want to change are practices, then we have to teach to practices. We have to be involved in helping people to learn, and I think the distinction between teaching and facilitating learning is an important one, but facilitating people learning how to change their practices, how to develop skills, how to feel and act in a more empowered way, how to interact in a way that expresses their own position in an institution differently. So I think we can measure norms, we can measure practices, we can measure structures. What we can't do often is measure how these things relate to each other over the long term. And when we want to have an assessment of the effectiveness of a training, we really need to be very clear up front what particular thing we're trying to change, and to recognize that those changes that we're thinking of as effects when we're trying to measure them in the short term, we also want to help them to be causes of changes in other things in the longer term. And we may not be able to measure those longer term changes, but we should think about the short term changes not just as how we can measure them now and what it is we want to measure now, which I think is really important to be clear about, but also to think about them and pick them in terms of how they can contribute to these broader changes over the long term, even if we can't measure those. Is that a little clearer? I hope so.
Yes, I think so. It's very clear and a very interesting answer, and I think Maggie will be very happy with it. And Lucy, perhaps I'd like to ask you about a question posed by Chithinma, who'd like to know, how does one factor in the culture and norms of a country in the design and development stage of creating change through training?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think to reiterate again what we've all said throughout these presentations, that everything has to be context specific is a starting point. And I think in the process of developing a theory of change for a particular intervention in a particular context, that for a start, appropriate and realistic goals for change to be identified, and that the entire process should be grounded in the specific context. I think we can have, I think we can develop broad frameworks or templates or approaches to developing theories of change, taking on board a lot of Myra's excellent work, and from those have something from which people can work in order to develop a specific theory of change that's relevant to their country context, to the specific culture and norms that are being targeted for change. And I think one methodological way of looking at that is thinking about the co-production or participatory process of developing theories of change. So that's engaging the commissioners of training, engaging the participants who are going to be participating in the training, engaging them in an active, co-constitutive way in identifying the assumptions, the challenges, and the potential targets and indicators of change. And in that way, I think that's something that can be brought into the training design and also into the implementation to help participants reflect on these ideas within their own organization and within their own specific context. I hope that's a clear answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucy. I think context specificity has a lot to do with it, and certainly with developing theories of change. And because we're a little bit short on time, perhaps we can move on a little bit to feminist pedagogies. And I'd like to ask Lian, if you're there, one
Yes.
contributor has asked, in your experience, what strategies have helped to integrate emotions and knowledge in order to facilitate change through training?
I've actually worked on this area with women workers. Let me share a little bit of the experience. One is actually intentionally addressing emotion in the learning training space, where you actually use processes of evoking talk and talking pain. There are a whole series of engaging activities where you can actually get people to talk about the kind of emotional subordination that they have experienced, and then unpacking deeper onto what this emotional subordination are, because most of them are silences, because a lot of women, for example, will repress such pain and not talk about it. So we actually you need to develop a strategy of what I call evoking talk, so that people are comfortable to talk. There are a whole series of activities where there are processes that you can enable people to evoke talk through arts-based methods as well as through creative dramatics, and using storytelling, sharing as a process of healing as well. And through that process, you actually also develop knowledge by doing analysis with the group and developing deeper understandings of women's silences around emotional pain, and for me that's subjugated knowledge. And that itself is very effective in helping people to understand the inequality that they have experienced and yet has been silenced, and how they could actually articulate that, and through that process of consciousness raising, move into reconstituting their own subjectivities, and from that into their own agency as individuals and as groups to take on specific actions to address the kind of issues that affect them. Does that make some sense?
Yes, that's very insightful. Thank you very much, Lian. And a little bit related to that, I'd like to ask Anand, since you spoke about the intersection of identities, one of our contributors would like to ask, when speaking about diversity and intersectionality, how can we translate this into practice in our programs, including, for example, those with disabilities, through applying feminist pedagogies to training for gender equality?
Thank you for this question, Sepde. Sorry if I mispronounced it. But as Myra's, Dr. Myra saying, nothing happens in social vacuum. Those diversities do exist and are nurtured, or are existed in particular social, cultural, and political context. So I think it again becomes very important to see what diversities are we talking about, and in what socio-cultural, political context the diversity is being addressed through our training programs. For instance, through training, for training, we need to really ask question, does our training modules has any content around sessions around diversities? Do one has intersectionality analysis of the experiences of people who are participating in the training programs or are coming from different societies? And programmatically, I think if you mean how do we translate that into implementation, I think like feminist principle reviews, and all people are not are different in different on the ladder of the power, and disability again is not a if I could say monolithic group. So because the inherent stratification of societies on the basis of different power structures also stratifies our friends with disabilities think about a man with disability and a woman with disability and a male to female transgender with disability, or a female to male transgender and disability, or transsexual with disability, or in Indian context think about a Dalit or so-called lower caste person with disabilities. So I think all these programs or interventions to translate the diversity principle with feminist principles, I think it should be based on the principles of affirmative actions and on the principles of equity. I hope I'm making sense here, because you know, it's not easy to convert these principles into practices or programs, and as long as we have very strong belief in that, and we are open to be flexible to design our program indicators considering all these diverse realities in the power hierarchy in the given societies and given cultures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anand. I think drawing on this, one of the last questions that was posed, which I could perhaps pose to all our speakers, whoever wishes to answer it, is how can we connect the political dimension of training for gender equality with the technical one, using feminist pedagogies, but I think also using a theory of change for training for gender equality. So whoever wants to reply, please.
I guess I could jump in first and just say that I think we need to be very careful about what is technical, a technical dimension. The more that we reduce the idea of what we're trying to do to a technical one, of giving people one particular skill or tool or even a toolkit for change that is something that you just kind of pick up and carry around with you, I think that depoliticizes it, and it makes people unaware both of the resistances that they will encounter and places them more in a position from which they're more likely to take that technical expertise and set oneself up as a teacher in the ways that we've been talking about, are kind of contradictory to a feminist pedagogy. So of course one needs to have technical skills, but the technical skills are in some sense the background that you have for engaging in a more political process. If the more that the technical goes into the foreground, if that's what you're teaching, or that's how you're teaching, or that's what people need to acquire, I think the more ineffective the training process will be.
That's very insightful, Myra. Do any of our other speakers have anything to add?
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
I completely agree with Myra. You know, reducing feminist pedagogy to technical skills certainly runs the risk of, you know, reducing the importance of what we're talking in a wider sense. But I think the very feminist pedagogy is about the analysis of power in the given setting. And that's the political dimension of gender training. If gender training is simply talking about social and cultural construct of biological sexes and not really bringing in the context of power to that, I think it highly depoliticizes the entire training programs, you know. And I have seen many people doing that, talking about what is a man and what is a woman, and talking about attributes of men and women, but not really talking about the power relations and gender power relations and how those are internalized and institutionalized. I think the whole idea of unless we really bring in power relations, I think, you know, bringing the power relation dimension to gender training itself is politicizing it, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, very much so, Anand. This has been something that has been raised a lot on our discussion forum, where we talk about the depoliticization of gender training and the challenges this faces. I don't know if Lian or Lucy, would you like to add anything to that about how this could be avoided perhaps through the application of feminist pedagogies or through the application of a theory of change to training for gender equality?
Perhaps I'll just respond quickly and say that I think everyone acknowledged in their presentations the kinds of resistances and the kinds of power dynamics and inequalities that we as gender trainers come up against and engage with in our practice. So I think that having the fundamental basis of feminist pedagogical principles behind us and the practices that we can use that draw on those as a way to be flexible, to be adaptable to the kinds of demands that we often face for technical training, for skills, for checklists. And while we have to accept that that may be the specific context of a particular training, and that may be what's been commissioned, I think that we can draw strongly on feminist pedagogical principles in creative ways in order to be kind of entrepreneurial about how we continue to bring those principles and practice into the training in ways whereby we can make the most and politicize to the maximum a specific training context, even where we're being demanded a very technical results and a technical training. So I think it's about playing with those boundaries in a creative way and always striving to apply the feminist pedagogical principles however we can, wherever we can.
Absolutely, Lucy. Lian, do you have anything to add? Yes, please.
Yes. For me, feminist pedagogy itself is political because it's grounded on issues of power relations. So to start off with, the use of feminist pedagogy is political. And if you want to bring in technical aspects, feminist pedagogy does not omit that, but it requires you then to contextualize it within the politics of gender training. So whatever, for example, whatever technical skills that you need to teach, it should not be just technical skills alone, but it should be contextualized within the politics of that gender training, and the application of feminist pedagogies itself would require you to approach it in certain different ways as from the norm of using it technically.
Thank you very much, Lian. I think we all completely agree with you and with all our other speakers about the importance of keeping feminist pedagogies and power dynamics in mind and intersectionality when we go through training for gender equality. And I'm very sorry, but that's all we have time for today. But I'd just like to remind the audience members that the questions that we couldn't get to, and there were many very good questions, we will post on the COP discussion forum. And once again, I'd like to thank all our esteemed panelists and our contributors in the audience for adding to our discussions today. Just to remind you, this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on the Training Center's Community of Practice webpage. The discussion forum will remain open until the 21st, so we urge you again to participate in this forum and continue to add to the debates on theory of change and feminist pedagogies. After the 21st, a final report of the dialogue will also be available on the COP platform. Just before we close, I'd like to remind you as well that we have an upcoming virtual dialogue which will be on the professionalization of gender trainers. This will be held from the 21st to the 11th of November on the COP platform, and we hope you'll join us for the discussions and also to tune in to our next webinar on professionalization, which will be on the 3rd of November. So once again, thank you very much to our panelists, Myra, Lucy, Lian, and Anand, to our audience members, and to all our COP members for making this webinar such a success. We hope to see you soon in the virtual dialogue discussion forum, and thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye.